distributor, you needed to get $60 million just to break even, $60 million in box office receipts. Now, as it happened, this movie brought in about $50 million in box office receipts. It was the 27th best-selling movie of 1947, but that was not sufficient, obviously, for it to break even. That's a problem, because Capra set up this movie company, Liberty Films. It is basically debt and virtually no equity, and this seals its fate. It makes one movie, and then it has to sell itself because it really has no finance left, because this movie didn't generate the money to film what were supposed to be 8 others. So it gets sold off into a movie company. It produces movies under the name of Liberty Films, but actually it's just part of a bigger conglomerate by then. Asked about his experience, because he did this twice. He did it in 38 and it failed. He did it in 47 and it failed. He said, "I'm not doing that anymore." I quote, "It was the most gentlemanly way of going broke and the fastest way anybody ever thought of." So just in case you're thinking of investigating movies, heed the word of Frank Capra. I think one of the most interesting things about Liberty Films is who the directors were who were in it. There were 3 directors, Capra, who had made these movies on the war, but there were 2 others. William Wyler, who made a movie, a documentary called The Memphis Belle. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it involved him getting into a bomber and flying over enemy territory and filming the crew at work. And he made that. And then George Stevens, even more heart-achingly, George Stevens was the first cameraman, or one of the first cameramen, to arrive at Auschwitz. And after the war was over, the 3 of them vowed they would never go back into the studio system again. They set up Liberty Films, but because of the commercial failure of this movie, they all ended back up in that same system. Now, that system doesn't exist anymore. The system, the movie which began in 1910, the whole industry, by 1920, the government is already trying to break it up. So we're looking at, obviously, a whole lot of monopolies, oligopolies today. It only took 10 years for the emergence of this new industry before the government tried to break it up. In particular, they were very concerned about distribution. So the movie studios, as you probably know, they booked all the directors, they booked the studios. They kind of had a stranglehold on the means of production, but they also had a stranglehold on the means of distribution. And in 1920, the government tried to stop that. And in 1947, they succeeded. It took them 27 years of various actions against these movie companies before they finally got there. And then you could have an independent production company, because then there was somewhere to show your movies. And this was one of the last movies ever made before that happened. So he had to give away a huge percentage of the revenue to RKO to distribute it to him. He wasn't able to go out and negotiate better terms. So this was one of the last movies that was sort of made by an independent movie company before the whole system began to break down. And Capra led that. In late 1941, he set up the Society of Independent Motion Picture Producers, which took the case that the government was letting lapse. He took a case against Universal, or against Paramount, a restraint of trade case. And obviously the war was on, but after the war, that was finally settled by the government, and suddenly the whole Hollywood system was falling apart. So this movie marks kind of the end of that. Now, the other thing about the movie is the political shift that's underway in America, which may not be dissimilar to the political shift that's currently underway, and with that I remain in relation to China. Obviously, for a long time prior to World War II, Americans weren't very keen on what they called commies, which was the common term at the time. But by World War II, they are the ally of the Soviet Union, and the US and the Soviet Union are together fighting a common enemy. Many filmmakers in Hollywood decided to make movies in support of the Soviet Union and its war effort, and most of them found themselves in trouble after World War II because of making those movies. American Congress started investigating un-American activities as early as 1918. They were having a big dive into the movie industry on the Dietz Committee as early as 1940, but they really got active after the war. In making his documentary about Russia and the fight Russia was having against Germany, he actually had to visit the Soviet embassy, and he made a big mistake. He went twice, but didn't go through official channels, but clearly was spotted by the FBI going into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. And this really didn't absolutely end his career, but it significantly undermined his career, because the FBI had a huge file on him after the war, including this comment on the movie you're about to watch. And I quote from the May 1947, the movie's general release, February 47. The film represented a rather obvious attempt to discredit bankers. Remember, the hero is a banker, a common trick used by communists. So this was, I think we're looking at one communist in this room here, I think. So, but Capra himself was a Republican. He hated Roosevelt. He hated the New Deal. And much to his later shame, he actually named 3 writers as communists in secret to the House of Un-American Activities. But anyway, this file hung over his neck for a long time. It was difficult for him to get funding. He was a major in the army. He did win the Distinguished Service Medal, but despite this, during the witch hunt, he wasn't able to make it any further. So as I said, of the 8 writers who were involved in this, 6 of them were suspected of being communists. One of them, by the way, was Dorothy Parker, who didn't have a great deal to do with the movie, but she was listed. So I'll just talk about a couple of the dramatis personae in this movie, and then we'll get cracking with the real thing. It didn't succeed commercially, but it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, Best Sound Recording, and Best Film Editing, and didn't win any. That all went to William Wyler, who made a very good movie about men coming home from war, which swept the board at those particular Oscars. It got mixed reviews, good reviews and bad reviews, but his most glowing review, much to Capra's chagrin, came from the Daily Worker, the Communist Party's newspaper of the United Kingdom, who said, one of those thought-stimulating films which Hollywood produces so rarely these days, a film of quality. And the worst thing you could hope for in 1947 was a really good review from the Communist Party's newspaper. Without giving too much away, there is a man called Clarence Otbody in this movie called Henry Travers. Henry was born just west of Newcastle upon Tyne, moved to Berwick-upon-Tweed. There is a theatre in Berwick-upon-Tweed, and if you go there, there are 2 rooms, and one of them is called the Henry Travers Room, in memory of the man who appears in this movie as Clarence Otbody. Another bit part actor in this is an actress called Gloria Graham, who in the terminology of the time would have been called a good time girl. That was the terminology of the late 40s. Nothing particularly of note of Gloria Graham, except her mum was called Jean McDougall from Lanarkshire, who emigrated to California much earlier on. Other ones with good stories, Ward Bond. Now, Ward Bond's an interesting guy because he's John Wayne's best friend. And let's put it this way, he's no commie. So Ward Bond plays the cop in this, and Ward Bond's prized possession was a shotgun, which John Wayne had shot him with, accidentally. But having shot him with it, he presented him with the gun. So you have here in this movie people who are later accused of being communists, working with people who are clearly on the other side of the fence. I'm going to read something from John Wayne, and I'm reading it word for word, so just to be absolutely clear, this is not my opinion. This is the opinion of John Wayne about Frank Capra, a leading member of the Republican Party. And this is what John Wayne said about him. He said, "I'd like to take that little Dago son of a bitch and throw him into the ocean and watch him float back to Sicily where he belongs." So this is co-workers talking about co-workers. There's a man here who you might recognize or might know. He stands behind Mr. Potter for this entire thing. He pushes Mr. Potter around in a wheelchair. He doesn't have a single line in this movie, and he looks like an absolute thug, and that is because he's a former heavyweight boxing champion, but he doesn't get any lines. Jimmy the Crow. You'll see Jimmy the Crow. He's in this movie. That's a bird, Jimmy the Crow. It's not a gangster. There is a problem with Jimmy the Crow. He's actually a raven. But he was a trained raven who appeared in, they think, possibly over 100 movies during this period. He appeared in every Frank Capra movie from 1938. Lloyd's of London had him insured for $160,000 US in today's money. Jimmy disappeared, like many stars, he disappeared into oblivion in 1952. And no one's really sure what happened to Jimmy the Crow. But Jimmy the Crow is a raven. I want to finish on the dramatis personae with James Stewart himself. So James Stewart was from Pennsylvania. He had also won an Oscar prior to this in the Philadelphia Story. He was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. And before Pearl Harbor, he volunteered. He was already a pilot, and he volunteered before Pearl Harbor to go into the U.S. I mean, the U.S. was not involved in the war, but he obviously thought it was going to be him, and he went off to train. They didn't want him to fly planes, but he flew 20 bombing missions over enemy territory as a pilot. There's a scene in this movie where Stuart looks over a bridge. I'm not going into any more details, and there's a look on his face. Remember, that's filmed only about a year after he was watching burning cities over Europe and airplanes falling out of the sky. He came back from the war a very different man. So that's just a little bit actually about the movie. You can probably tell that I can talk about it for much longer. But the reason we're here is to look at a different form of economics. So it's said that economics is the dismal science. It was Thomas Carlyle who coined that term in 1849. And I think he termed it because he'd looked at the forecasts of Thomas Malthus, which forecast that we were all going to die of hunger and thirst, and turned out to be incorrect. But the economists have chosen to be dismal because they have chosen to spend their lives in the presence of something called the rational economic man. Now, it's been my good fortune to be on the planet for 60 years and never have met a rational economic man. But if there's anything that appropriates to a rational economic man, perhaps it is the Mr. Potter you're about to encounter in this movie. And it isn't a great surprise to me that economists are dismal if these are the people they choose to spend their lives with. Let me tell you in conclusion what Frank Capra thought this movie was about. I mean, I said kind of jokingly it's about banking, but let me tell you what he thinks it's about. And he wrote this in the 1980s. It's a Wonderful Life sums up my philosophy of filmmaking. First, to exalt the worth of the individual, not exactly communism. Second, to champion man, please his causes, protest any degradation of his dignity, spirit, or divinity. And third, to dramatize the viability of the individual as the theme of the film itself. I wanted It's a Wonderful Life to say what Walt Whitman said to every man, woman, and babe in the world, quote, the sum of all known reverences I add up in you, whoever you are. I wanted it to reflect compelling words of Fra Giovanni of nearly 5 centuries ago, quote, the gloom of the world is but a shadow. Behind it, yet within reach is joy. There is a radiance and glory in the darkness, could we but see. And to see, we have only to look. I beseech you to look. Well, here at the Library of Mistakes, we don't do the dismal science. And there is somewhere still where it's a wonderful life. Thank you.